Good. So I saw David's slides yesterday, and that made my task a lot easier because I agree with everything he said, and I could throw out half of what I wanted to say, so I could be a bit more focused. I thought, so my focus will be as a researcher, and a researcher, as Brian said, I'm a social psychologist, so I spend much of my time researching with children and parents in family homes. And looking at the provocation that we were given, that technology is addictive, what do we think about this discourse? And I thought, okay, so if addiction is the problem, screen time is the solution, and I think both of us will see a strong connection between the addiction discourse and the screen time discourse. So I've been thinking about the kinds of evidence that we produce and the wider community of children and technology produces, and the ways in which that evidence gets used. And just to give you kind of one story of what I'm engaged in at the moment that really provoked me to think. So I think a number of countries have produced their screen time rules in the last period, perhaps triggered by the American Academy of Pediatrics rethinking theirs. So in Britain we're doing the same, and I'm on the group for the under 5s, trying to produce the screen time rules. So I was presented, it's a very well-meaning group, so I don't want to undermine the effort, but I was concerned to see that the entire body of evidence that we were looking at was about the relationship between hours of screen time and harms done to children, to their sleeping, to their eyesight, to their concentration, to their learning, to their vocabulary, etc. We got a long litany of all the negatives. And I said, what about the work of this group? And I sent them, as it were, my list of all the studies that could also say, but screen use, engagement with technology, also brings all of these positives. And they said something that Rosie said earlier, well, these are not meeting our kind of standards of RCTs, etc. But more important, sorry, they haven't got our measure, because we're looking at how young children engage with digital media and the educational benefits and such, but we're not correlating those benefits with a single measure of screen time. And so all of those studies were ruled out, and so we were just left with all the negative studies, and therefore all the conversation was about rules. So to me that was a real kind of learning moment, and it was impossible to argue with a kind of set of folk with a medical mindset that because we're not using that outcome, that measure of screen time. Anyway, so you can see the so that's one kind of concern. Secondly, I just wanted to say something about, in response to Jenny Radetzky's proposal of functional impairment, and just to kind of reference the fact that the eKids Online Network, which many members are here in this room, has for the last 10 years been talking about excessive use and its adverse consequences, and measuring excessive use precisely as judged by the individual in whether they use it so much that it stops them sleeping or eating or talking to family or engaging with schoolwork. And if you could say there is a adverse cost elsewhere, then there is rationale for talking about excessive use. But addiction is a whole different ballgame. So one of the things I wanted to point out today and discuss is the way in which the addiction discourse is part of a much bigger vision. So the kind of bigger vision, which I think David also hinted at, is the sense that we're going to hell in a handcart, as we say in Britain. There's probably, I don't know how everyone just translated that. That would be interesting to know. It is a problem with technology, but the problem is that we have a problem with children. And I think that's really what motivates a lot of us when we think the idea that technology could and has the capacity to destroy an entire generation. So Jean Twain-King's book, which she had a short article in The Atlantic that this is produced this image, and I've just put up one of her graphs. So in her book is stacked full of evidence. It's not that we have a lack of evidence. It's a particular kind of evidence. So as with the screen time rules, this is now for older children, but it's a particular kind of evidence that is being mobilised to establish the case that the technology is the problem and is the sole problem. So she draws So she has a lot of longitudinal data, which of course many of us would die for. We would love to be able to follow, children over the years in which technology has been adopted. This one is about how much children feel lonely, and she draws a very precise time point that children's loneliness began to increase at the moment at which the iPhone was released in the US. So, we teach our students in kind of Methods 101, do not infer causation from correlation. Please think about all the other factors that might account for what looks like a very clear correlation. We show all our students that fabulous website of the spurious correlations between all kinds of factors. So, what else happened in the early 2000s? Well, I might point out austerity would be, one good option. We could think of a host of other things. So when you start digging, and I always, every time I see one of these screen time headlines or internet addiction headlines, I always kind of start going backwards in a rabbit hole. That's another British metaphor. I don't know what people do in different languages. They probably don't go down rabbit holes, but you kind of start going backwards. Here's the headline. Who said something to the journalist? What was the research evidence behind that? Let me go and look at that research evidence and see what kind of methodology, what kind of sample, when was it done? What was controlled for? Did they control for all the other things in those children's lives that might have accounted for an apparent correlation between the way in which they engage with technology and adverse consequences as measured? That's another thing I put to the screen time guidelines folk. Could they tell me in all of these studies correlating amount of screen time and adverse effects on sleep that they had controlled for all the other things that might be, as it were, both the cause of children's technology use and the cause of their sleep problems? No, they couldn't often tell me that. So there's something about the technology which is so salient that it seems to be providing, as it were, the answer to a whole set of other problems. And I don't say children's lives are problem-free, far from it. But there's a lot of problems to which technology is the kind of the most salient, most visible thing that seems to present itself as the answer. And why is that? It presents itself as the answer, of course, partly because it's the thing that wasn't there in the parents' childhood, in the teacher's childhood, in the policy maker's childhood, definitely not in the government minister's childhood, because that was a while ago. And it is there in the hands of the children that they're worrying about today. So it seems to it's the kind of become the go-to single solution. So in Britain this week, the latest government minister has decided that we will ban mobile phones in schools. I just despair of those people developing entire programs on learning and digital learning through children having their own devices, all the arguments we've made about how the bring your own device makes the link between the home and the school, the learning anywhere, anytime, all gone. It's all, as it were, the addiction discourse is winning. So we get a very kind of monolithic discourse, we get a kind of single cause postulated for the various correlations that may or may not be robustly observed, and we get a complete exclusion of any kind of consideration of the opportunities that technologies bring. And I don't want to sound like a kind of apologist for technologies, because I think there are risks. Those of you who know my work will know that it's precisely thinking about the balance between the risks and the opportunities that is crucial. But in a discourse where all the opportunities are dropped out, we have to take a critical stance. So that's my kind of framing, and a lot of the ideas I put in a brief that Alicia Blum-Ross and I wrote on the left-hand side of that screen, where we try to review the emerging research and also the advice that is coming, especially to parents, as they think how to address screen time in the lives of their children that they did not have when they themselves were children. It's part of a project called Parenting for a Digital Future, where we're really asking parents to look back at their childhoods, forward to their children's adulthood, and then kind of use that as the framework within which to understand how are they thinking now. That's a qualitative project, and our emphasis has really been on the diversity of families, all the different things, all the different problems that they are facing, from families who are migrants and may not speak the language of the advice that comes to them from the Department of Health, to families of children, who have children with special educational needs that don't really hope that technology might be a very special kind of workaround for their child, and screen time advice is deeply problematic. Trying to recognise the different kinds of contexts within which families are differently using technologies, because what you always get from that kind of screen time discourse is a sense that all families are the same, all kids are staring at screens, and that there's a kind of homogeneity in the whole language of lumping together children and parents. So that came out a couple of years ago, and from it we developed an infographic for parents, which I will show you at the end, because I hope it's going to be useful for the campaign that we're going to discuss tomorrow. But I thought in the next few minutes I'd just show you a few findings from a survey that we just did, Alicia and I, and that's the report on the right, when we surveyed a national sample of 2,000 British parents of children, in fact aged 0 to 17, but I'm trying to pull out the younger children findings for you, in which we try to kind of see, okay, so what is the parents' perspective? And I'm going to flash 5 sets of findings at you, which I'm very, very glad that David made sure that the other screens are functioning as well. So Alicia and I also have 3 C's, but they're content, context and connections. So I think we're all probably arguing in the same kind of direction, but our work is funded by the MacArthur Foundation's Connected Learning Research Network, and the purpose of that network is to really understand what kinds of connections children make in their learning lives and the ways in which digital technology might underpin those connections. And we're thinking of all kinds of connections, but especially those that support different kinds of learning, and especially those which cross sites. So from home to school, to non-formal learning centres, to online settings, because children make the connections across those different sites. Technologies can mediate those different kinds of connections, and what we think is the kind of missing link is that parents, especially parents of small children, are also taking the children to all the different parts of their lives. And very often we see in learning settings of all kinds that the parent is the person who is kind of at the door and might seem to be a bit troublesome, so don't let them come in too far. And the potential of parents to positively kind of harness the ways in which children learn in one place and could be supported in others is often missed. So that's the kind of framework within which we're thinking. And it was with that in mind that one of the first questions we wanted to ask parents was, what are the things that you do together, and where do digital technologies fit into what activities parents and children do together? And I think what for me is striking in the age when you think all children are doing is playing with their smartphones and tablets, is that watching television and films at home is the second most thing that families do together. It's not just the child all by themselves in front of that screen, and the sense that the child is always alone in front of the screen, as David said, in that kind of darkened room, is not the only way in which screens are used. Families are embedding technologies into their lives, and you can see of the different things. You know, sometimes when journalists interview me, you might think that kids and families never go to the park anymore, or never play a game, or never go swimming, because they're always all stared at their separate screens. And I just say, look, there's a lot of different things that families are doing together, and technologies are differently finding their ways into that. Just to point out as well that when we say screen time should be strictly limited, we should think about some of the positive activities that therefore get limited, like the ways in which families use screens to chat together or interact, or four up from the bottom, the way in which fathers especially play video games and computer games with their children. And if you say limit screen time, you might be limiting one of the things that fathers feel empowered that they can do with their children. We should just really think about what those consequences might be. Secondly, in the screen time debate, where is attention to the way in which parents are already using a range of different technologies to support their children's learning at home, and we have in other survey findings the ways in which they then take them to different kinds of informal and non-formal learning sites. Parents are not the digital immigrants that they used to be. Parents are also themselves often digital natives, often skilled in the way in which they use technology. And they are finding all kinds of ways in which the technology can be part of their children's learning. I think the diversity there is striking. The fact that they're doing it, including children from 0 to 4, there's quite a lot of different kinds of activities. There are notable social class differences in these practices, and it's one of the kind of interesting things how much screen time is particularly, or screen activities are particularly taken up by more educated and more middle class families. I think the worry in the back of people's minds is really about what poorer families are doing, but what we see is, and in other spaces, of course, we think about the inequalities with which families from different socioeconomic backgrounds get to benefit from some of the things that technologies really can offer. Parental mediation is a kind of an old favourite of many researchers of children and media. I think there's now there's a big strand of literature on parental mediation, which is all about how can parents more successfully restrict their children's screen media use so that the harms are reduced. And one of the things that we've worked really hard on in the eKids Online network and since in other spaces is to think about the enabling activities that parents can also do that will help their children become more digitally skilled, more digitally resilient, engage with a wider range of activities online. And what we showed in eKids Online is that it's the enabling activities that parents do, not the restrictive ones, the enabling ones that help children develop the skills, gain the opportunities, gain the benefits of a digital world which is hardly going to go away. So let's make sure they optimise it. So one of the things that we're Alicia and I have been very interested in interviewing parents is the kind of anxiety that parents are associating with the screen media. And in fact, at the moment we're trying to finish our book manuscript, and we begin the book with the moment of kind of arriving at the home, and the parents know we're going to ask them about digital technologies, and they just begin talking on the doorstep. We need to talk about these digital technologies and what we're doing with them, and the kind of anxiety about them. And an anxiety that is led by the kind of headlines that David just showed. So we wanted to know who's guiding parents, where do they get their advice from? And so we compared where they get their advice in relation to their child's digital media use with where they get it in general, or in relation to all the other challenges that they face as parents. And from this I take two key findings. One is that parents are doing a lot of figuring things out on their own. I mean, if we wanted to understand why parents are being talked about as an anxious group, it's because they are searching online or they're figuring it out from themselves. But for all the other sources of advice, they are more confident in getting more advice about their parenting for the traditional problems of parenting than they are for digital media. For digital media use, they can't ask their parents in the same way, they can't ask health professionals in the same way. Where are they going to turn for their advice? Even their friends, there isn't enough knowledge around for parents to feel adequately guided. And I think that's really part of the anxiety. And last, and other researchers have also shown this, I just thought to put up, we wanted to get a reality check. What kind of a conflict is screen time occasioning in the home? And people were telling us, okay, you're just obsessed with digital media, Sonia, but actually it's bedtime that's the real problem. It's what the kids eat that's the real problem. It's, there's money that's the real problem. So we asked parents which of all of these different things led to conflicts. And you can see that screen time is number 3.
So it's not working.
It stopped working? It just stopped. Oh. Did I press something?
Is there the power one? So
is that working now? Battery. Oh. I'm over time, so should I just... I could just stop. I don't know. Oh, yeah, I sound amplified at this end.
I think it's just the last round, so the microphone is ask Janice if she can hear.
Janice, can you hear okay down the back? Can you hear all right?
We can hear.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Then I'm going to be very... Okay, is that better now? All right, cool. So I just wanted to point out the contrast in this graph between screen time being a cause of anxiety and conflict in the home, but what children do on the internet, much less so. So if we could switch the discourse to context, content and connections, we would be causing much less conflict within the home. So this is my final slide just to sum up, because I think I'm now over time. So I think what I wanted to say by way of summary is the screen time addiction cause has become itself, as it were, a force in the world. It's become a way in which parents express their worries about their child now and in the future. It's become a way in which parents judge themselves, and we heard a lot about this in our qualitative work, and they judge each other for their, and the metaphor is the metaphor of the police. Parents are always telling us how well they police their children. When policing became a good metaphor for parenting, I don't know, but I find it bizarre how much parents talk about policing screen time. We hear the same discourse from children. Children will tell me that they're addicted to the internet or they're addicted to their game. They too talk about their worries about their screen time. It's become a shared discourse. Why is any of that a problem? Because complex decisions about the ways in which individuals might use media in ways that could benefit them and sometimes cause problems gets reduced to a very simple rule in which parents are constantly being advised to look at the clock instead of look at their child and make a judgment about what their child is doing. And because everyone is so focused on getting the screen time message out, we're not answering the questions that parents do have about which are the good apps or what are the valuable resources or where could my child go online or what is working for them and what is a problem. And just to end on one quote, this is an interview that Alicia did when she was interviewing a parent and the child had got an app on their computer called Self-Control. So when the child walked into the room, the parent said to the child, "And have you got your self-control turned on?" It was just, how is that a good conversation? Oh, and here's the infographic. We maybe talk about this tomorrow, but this is really our attempt to say, okay, think about context, content, and connections. Think about how to direct children towards positive uses of screen time, as well as keep things in balance, and make known to parents what are better constructive resources for them to turn to. Thank you very much.